Hello, this is Eric Morris Eskenazi. I'm the host of the Iraq Dispatches podcast. Thanks for tuning into this latest episode featuring an interview with John Baltisberger, who's an author, poet, and publisher. John runs a company based in Austin, Texas called Madness Heart Press, in which he publishes books by authors dealing with such elements as fantasy, horror, splatterpunk, and Jewish mysticism and folklore. John is also a very prolific writer himself, and many of his books are featured on the Madness Heart website. Definitely check it out. He's a very interesting and upcoming author. Hello, thanks for listening to the Erratic Dispatches podcast. We'll be back shortly after a brief break. Hello, I've been using Anchor.fm now for about almost a year for the podcast Erratic Dispatches, which is distributed through Anchor.fm. It's completely free to use, very easy, and any audio that you upload or record through the website, it will be you can use it to organize your audio files, and once your podcasts are ready to submit, it will be available to stream within at least 8 different streaming sites. So, John, do you mind starting off with talking about like how you began getting into writing and poetry, and like were there any particular writers growing up as a kid that really inspired you to get into it?
So I got my interest in writing and storytelling and fantasy. Authors like Pierce Anthony and Robert Asprin. Authors I'm a little embarrassed of now, honestly. But I was really into fantasy, and I played Dungeons and Dragons, and the idea of creating my own stories and my own worlds within these fantasies was really appealing to me. And when I got started writing, I started writing with fantasy in mind. As far as poetry goes, I've always written poetry. I don't know why. But I've always, I started off writing fantasy poetry and then kind of edgelord teenage poetry. And now I write, pardon me. Now I write edgelord splatterpunk poetry. So it's all circular.
Mm-hmm. And like, I know that I was looking over your, like all the novels you've been writing recently. You've been very prolific over the past, I guess, couple of years. I'm assuming that you've been writing a lot during the shutdown, last year.
The shutdown didn't really have much to do with my particular prolificacy. I work from home. I run my day job from home, my business from home, my writing career from home. In fact, because my wife and daughter were home instead of out in the world working and going to school, I actually had less time to write during the lockdown we had here in Texas.
And then, like, do you mind like just like getting to start discussing about like incorporating Jewish, like myths and folklore and mysticism in your work, and how you incorporate that with the horror genre as well?
Sure, it's one of my favorite subjects. Okay. Judaism is a culture and faith that's 6,000 years old. It's ancient by any understanding of the word, right? But most Jewish literature focuses either on Holocaust studies or Torah studies. And as soon as I say I write Jewish horror, people are like, "Oh, it's golems and Nazis." Like there's so much other stuff going on in Jewish folklore and mythology to explore. And there's a lot more to Jewish history than just like the worst 20 years of it. So I actually got started writing knowing I needed to write Jewish stuff because I kept running into really offensive Jewish stereotypes written by either atheist or Christian non-Jewish authors. Specifically like yeah, I know, honey, it's cooking. Sorry. Specifically a guy named Kevin Hearn, who wrote the Iron Druid series, had this moment where these Kabbalists come out and they have the side locks. They're very Hasidic, very Orthodox. And he's like, oh, what's Kabbalah? Oh, I know, it's magic beards because Jews have beards. It was just so frustrating and offensive to be like, for an entire subculture of Judaism to be boiled down to, they have weird beards and that'll be their thing. I didn't think it wasn't clever. It wasn't funny. It wasn't respectful. And so I knew I needed to write stuff that really touched not only on Jewish culture, but Jewish mythology, and kind of champion the idea of disabusing the public at large of certain misconceptions they have about Judaism.
And like the type of like research you did about different type of Jewish folklore, is it taken from like both like Ashkenazi and Sephardic?
Yeah. So, the majority of what I have access to tends to be Ashkenazi. It's just European myths are more prevalent in the mainstream of Judaism in America, which is where I live. But that said, like when I can get my hands on Sephardi mythology, I'm all over it. My rabbi, may his memory be for a blessing, who passed just 2 days ago.
Sorry to hear that.
Thank you. Said Jews have believed an astounding number of things over the last 6,000 years. Just because a certain group or a certain time period doesn't believe those things doesn't make them less Jewish. So I really tried to pull from any aspect of Jewish belief, and due to the diaspora where Jews have spread throughout the world, we've lent Jewish thought to various myths throughout the world, and various cultures have also brought their myths into Judaism. So there's a lot to pull from, and a lot to to think about and consider.
Like growing up in Texas, like is there like a large, like I guess is there like any like Orthodox communities within Texas, or were you? Did you grow up like secular, or did you grow up like your family like a mix between like secular and Orthodox or modern Orthodox?
I grew up Baptist.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. so fundamentalist in a different direction. But there is an Orthodox and a Hasidic community in Texas. I don't know if I would say I'm friends with the local Chabad, but we are familiar with each other. I go to their events, I attend their classes. They know I'm doing my thing. They are less thrilled about a Jewish splatterpunk than, say, the Reform, the Reconstruction guys are. But they celebrate my success nonetheless.
That's great. And like with your writings, like your current writings, do you ever tap in like in some about like what's going on now with the rise of anti-Semitism in the country and around the world?
Yes. My last novella, not my last novella, but my novella from last year, Blood and Mud, is a direct response to the rising acceptance of neo-fascism in America. And I don't tend to write a lot about it because it's a topic that is well worn. People are very comfortable with it. So it's not something that I feel has to be hammered home. That said, I have a series called The Crimes and Passions of John Baltisberger, which is nothing except one guy murdering Nazis. It's the entire, there's no, that's the plot. But that's fun. It's not deep. It's not meaningful. It's not theological or philosophical. It's just dumb, mindless fun.
And has there been any particular films that you've seen that you admire that have Jewish themes in them and that do mix with the horror genre?
It's funny because a lot of films, a lot of people will immediately jump at a movie called The Possession, which I hate. I hate that film. I don't hate that film as a movie. I hate that film as a Jewish movie because it's not. It's a Catholic movie where they replace the priest with a rabbi. And the rabbi doesn't act like a rabbi. So I really get frustrated by that. There's a more recent movie called The Vigil,
Mm-hmm.
and it's fantastic. It starts off with a support group for people who have left the Hasidic movement, the Orthodox community, and it it doesn't hold anyone's hand with like what is sitting Shiva, what is this vigil thing, what is this kind of demon, what is this. They just go into it, and I love that. And it's very Jewish and it's very fun, and I really enjoyed it. Um, there aren't, like I said, most of the times when you see Judaism and horror, or Judaism and mysticism, it's a golem and a Nazi.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the strain. Uh, One of the main characters is an old Jewish man who first encountered the master vampire in Nazi Germany. I think they do a fun, like it's a fun book and it's meaningful, but again, it's a well-worn stone.
Mm-hmm. Like one film that like recently, I guess this week it's celebrating its like 40th anniversary, is an American Werewolf in London, which has like Jewish characters in it, and like on the it was like a Blu-ray edition that came out a few years ago where someone did a whole essay about like the history of the werewolf, and like the guy, I think his name was Curtis Siodmak, who wrote the screenplay for the original Universal classic, like blended some mysticism in that as well, like with Europe and stuff like that. It was really interesting.
My most recent novel has a werewolf in it.
Oh yeah.
And because the werewolf does play a very important part in Jewish mystical history. There's a person who was alive, like a real person named the Baal Shem Tov, and people believed he was capable of miracles and magic. He was a wondrous figure, a mythological figure who really existed, right? And one of the myths about him is that he fought a werewolf. And so I was pulling from that. And while I was pulling from this, I also pulled from a 16th century, 16th or 18th century German serial killer who people thought was a werewolf. In fact, when he was executed, one of the crimes he was executed for was werewolfism. So, werewolves is again, because Jews have been through all corners of the world. It's we pull mythologies from all over and kind of it's almost hard to find a theme in which there isn't at least a Jewish version of it.
Mm-hmm. And then in your book, Blood and Mud, I guess you also incorporate like the golem like story.
So Blood and Mud, I wanted to create a bridge that Christians would and non-Jews would find comfortable. So there's a lot of characters in that book that and themes in that book where people will be like, oh, I recognize that. That is recognizable from the Christian mythology I've grown up with. But there's definitely a Jewish slant on them, and I call it a golem. It's not really a golem in the strictest terms of what a golem is according to Jewish mythology, but I made some creative choices so that I could do it.
And then like within Jewish folklore, are there any like well-known stories that involve like ghosts?
Yeah, the Dybbuk.
The Dybbuk.
And the Dybbuk, with the rise of the dark web, the Dybbuk box became a pretty common phrase for people to know. I haven't done a lot with Dybbuks yet, although the first chapter of my first novel was called "A Dybbuk Went Down to Memphis." So there's Bernstein did an opera called The Dybbuk, based on Jewish folk tale. And if you know it's there, if you're aware of it, it's very prevalent. Whenever I tell people I write books about a Jewish exorcist, I always get weird looks because exorcism is like, oh, that's a Catholic thing. However, in the Christian Bible, Jesus exorcises a pig, which he would have done thousands of years before the rise of the Catholic Church. So there are exorcisms in Judaism dealing with ghosts and demons, but they are very different than something I think a Catholic or Christian might recognize.
Is there like a community of other like Jewish writers that you know or that you communicated with that are really into horror, like yourself?
Yeah, I'm a member of a group called the Jewish Horror Authors Guild. We have a book coming out soon, and I want to say it's going to happen in November, right around Hanukkah, called The Big Book of Jewish Horror. I'm also friends with a lot of Jewish bizarro authors and Jewish poets. I'm publishing a book from Max Bauman next month, no, in October, I think, called The Giant Robots of Babel. So like there's a ton of Jewish authors and Jewish horror authors, but again, the Jewish literary world is very stuck in what it wants to see. And part of my mission statement is to break that, to introduce the world to this new face of literature, if you will.
And what do you think it is about horror that attracts Jews? You know, like not only with literature, but with film, because there have been like some of the most famous like horror films were directed by Jews, like Stanley Kubrick with The Shining, Roman Polanski, Rosemary's Baby, Richard Donner with the Omen. You know, what is it you think that draws Jews, and like Eli Roth, of course, with this, and Ari Aster? What do you think it is about the horror genre that really just attracts them to it?
So really interesting. I actually just sat on a panel at a convention about this, and it's partially because Jews don't look at blasphemy and sin the same way. There is no damnation, right? There's no permanent going to hell. And so like, oh, I can't do this because it's not right to do. Like, no, there's no lines. Eli Roth doesn't have lines. Stanley Kubrick certainly didn't have lines, and maybe he should have. But when you're looking at these themes, these scary, terrifying themes, you're able to look at them without any fear of punishment. The Jewish people have had the shit end of the stick for a few thousand years at the hands of, you know, Europeans and it brings a certain mindset that I've seen of defiance. And one of the best ways to be defiant is to create upsetting art. And horror should make you uncomfortable. If you feel comfortable in the horror you're reading, it's not really doing its job.
And so you tend to be drawn to really like challenging work, you know, stuff that's just really out there and just disturbing.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I consider myself to be a splatterpunk.
Mm-hmm. And talk about a little bit about your nonfiction. I know you wrote a book about esoteric.
Yeah, I've done a few essays for a few journals and stuff, and I wrote a meditation guide that broaches on subjects of esoteric thought, which some people will call fiction. But I had a friend who asked me if I could just explain the basics of Kabbalah and Kabbalistic thought, and I was like, yeah, I could do that. And I started writing this book, and I realized I wasn't writing anything about Kabbalah from a macro point of view. I was just explaining things that were in line with my Kabbalic thought process. The book is meant to help people overcome hurdles in life. It's written in chapters. The first little sections is ways to meditate, you know, walking, chanting, sitting, visualization, mindfulness. And then the second chapter is separated into feelings that you might need to overcome. The second section, is separated into feelings you may need to overcome. And then there's another section that is just concepts. And each one is like, okay, let's talk about the concept of the body. Let's talk about the concept of the self. Let's talk about the concept of nothingness. And I wrote that specifically in order, hopefully, to help people have something handy in which they could take a moment out of a sort of painful point in their life, get a new perspective, and be able to overcome whatever was holding them back from being happy or at peace.
Are you familiar with Alejandro Jodorowsky?
I don't believe I am.
He's a Chilean Jew.
Okay.
He's most famous for making these very like huge cult films from the 70s, like El Topo and The Holy Mountain. Like he kind of blends like mysticism, esotericism in his movies. His films are very like psychedelic. They were like very popular back in that time during the midnight movies. But then coming from Chile, like a Catholic country, he does kind of blend in Catholicism with his films too. Like one of his a film that he did in the late 80s was called Santa Sangre. But he spent a lot of time in Paris, and then he like worked with Mobius, like the French illustrator. He did like graphic novels, and he's into kind of like tarot cards and that sort of thing.
Really I've been meaning to watch El Topo for quite a while. I finished writing a Jewish Western splatterpunk book, and as I was writing that, people kept telling me, "Oh, you have to watch El Topo. You have to watch Topo." So it's on my list. I will watch it soon as I have time.
Yeah, so yeah, he's Jewish, and like his more recent films have been very autobiographical about growing up in Chile. His parents were like immigrants, I think, from like either Russia or Ukraine, and they escaped because of the pogroms, and they came down there. And he kind of deals with anti-Semitism, what was going on in Chile, and how eventually, they eventually moved to France. It's a very interesting artist, and I'm sure also you're probably familiar with David Cronenberg, who's also Jewish as well, and his films are really amazing.
My last novella, Abhorrent Siren, is a very Cronenbergian kaiju story. I don't think there are any people in my particular subgroup of writers that aren't Cronenberg fans.
Yeah, talk about kaiju. Like I know that, so that's basically like Japanese. That's like monsters, like Godzilla. Do you mind talking a little bit about that?
The word kaiju means strange creature, strange beast. But realistically, when someone says kaiju, they mean a giant monster. I love giant monsters. I love giant monster movies where they punch each other and everything is blowing up and exploding. However, I don't think those are good kaiju films. I like Godzilla, I like Gamera, I like Ultraman, I like the whole gamut. Like if there's something big, I'm usually pretty happy. That said, I don't think those are good films. I think the good films are the ones where the kaiju represent something bigger than even themselves. There's an article coming out in the next issue of Stranger with Friction that I kind of talk about this, where in reality, I think there are 3 good Godzilla movies. I enjoy them all. Like, I love all of them, but there are 3 good ones. Gojira from 1954, Godzilla Returns from 1984, and Shin Godzilla from 2016. Each of those, there's no other monster he's fighting. It's just a statement on the socio-political economic strife of Japan and their fears of losing their way morally, not being able to respond politically, or, of course, their fears of radiation and the cost of both the nuclear bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima and the tests that the French and I believe British were conducting off Japanese shores. I love kaiju. I love writing kaiju stuff. I write a lot of kaiju stuff. Not all of it is allegory, but all the best ones are. So in Blood and Mud, again, it's the kaiju is really people's acceptance of bigotry. And in Abhorrent Siren, the kaiju is really the opioid crisis in America.
Wow. And do you also work on like writing text or doing illustrations for graphic novels?
I want to. I'm very interested in doing comic script writing, but it's not something I've delved into yet. And I can't draw. Can't draw at all. So that's off the table for me.
Do you write screenplays as well, or have you like adapted any of your novels or short stories into the screenplay?
Again, that's it's on my to-do list. Screenwriting is where the money is. It's just, and I have friends that are very successful that like have been able to make their living as writers because they screenwrite. But I haven't made that leap yet. But I will. It's just, I have not yet convinced myself to do the uncomfortable task of learning the skill.
And do you think there's like a sizable market for those interested in reading about Jewish horror?
Yes, I think that so look, there's the writing in a niche like I do, right? It's a bell curve. I say I write horror. That's lowest common denominator. That's at the bottom of the bell curve with max interest. And I'm like, okay, I write splatterpunk. That's a little extreme. I've lost a big chunk of people. I write Jewish splatterpunk. Oh, that's pretty niche. I write Jewish splatterpunk and I write it in verse. I've lost everyone. Like no one's paying attention to me anymore. I write Jewish splatterpunk kaiju stories in verse. What? You do? No, what is this? I have to read it. I have to see what the hell you're talking about. When I'm at a convention, I always say I write Jewish horror, I write kaiju horror, I write Jewish kaiju horror poetry. And generally speaking, you see people go, what? People love exotic stuff. People love stuff that they're not familiar with. And Judaism is this really beautiful place where it's just everyday enough that you don't feel like you're being punched in the side of the head by something you've never heard of before, but just exotic enough to be alien. So it sits in a really comfortable place, and I honestly get nothing but positive feedback for doing Jewish horror.
Hello, thanks for listening to the Erratic Dispatches podcast. We'll be back shortly after a brief break. And you think you might also, like, at some point, like, might be interested in, like, maybe trying to adapt one of your works to, like, you know, like a series or limited series?
I do. I mean, I have a few serial books. I'd love to see them either in comic or TV format. That's all. Like, again, that's where the money is, but it's also like, I think it's every author's dream to see something they wrote on the big screen, hopefully not butchered. I'm very honored to be able to say I'm friends with John Skip. John Skip is the guy who wrote, we gave him an award the other day, for Lifetime Achievement Award. And someone asked, hey, has anything you ever wrote that you wrote a movie and then you were just so disappointed in the way it turned out? And before he answered, I was like, John Skip wrote Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child. Yes, he's been disappointed in the way something turned out. So, like, yeah, I do want that. I fear seeing someone else touching all over my babies, but I know that that's where I'll be successful. That's where I'll be able to make my living as a writer. And, you know, that's the dream. Like in Texas, where you live, is there any aspects about the state's culture that inspire your writing? Oh, I write my main series, the Book of Zev. The second book just came out. I'm working on the third book now. It's set in Texas. Abhorrent Siren is set in Texas too. A lot of my short stories are set in Texas. I grew up here in Texas. It's kind of a horrifying place. You have mega cities full of crime, such as Houston and Dallas. You have a weird gentrification going on in Austin. You have these hundreds of miles of nothing but ranches and dilapidated farmhouses filled with demons, I'm sure. You have the racism, you have the anti-Semitism, you have the weird religious fanatics. Like Texas is a smorgasbord of horror that you can just cherry pick and pull from any direction and find something to write about.
And do you ever go to the library or just go online and research any kind of weird obscure stories of Texan history that you might have incorporated in your own work?
I actually generally go around it the other way, where I find something weird in either Jewish history or I do want to do a kaiju thing, and then I look up the history to try to find out where I can make it fit. When I did my Jewish splatter Western, I did a lot of research to find ways to make it closer to reality and find good historic connective tissue.
And do you mind talking a little bit about your publishing company?
Yeah, Madness Art Press, and I gotta try it. It's an imprint of Madness Art Press. So Madness Art Press is a horror publishing company. We don't focus just on splatterpunk and extreme. We also do bizarro. We also do we don't really do just everyday horror. It's not that there's not money in it, it's that there's already 100 publishing companies that do everyday horror. So our goal is to always publish stuff that we think other publishers will balk at. Stuff that may not be financially viable all the time, but I feel it needs to exist in the world. My wife and I started it together in late 2018, early 2019, and it's been a wild ride. It's been a good one. And then I Gotta Try It is a imprint of Madness Art Press, and it does Jewish speculative fiction, not just horror, but bizarro, fantasy, sci-fi, anything in that melange of mythic storytelling.
And do you work with the international writers, or mostly here in the States?
Look, Jillian, I love you. I prefer not to work with international writers, but I do. It's a pain in the butt because of our schedules and trying to get books to them and all that. But I do, mostly Australian.
Really?
There's a lot of Australian authors that look for American publishers, and a lot of them are really good, such as Jillian Pollock, whose book The Green Children Help Out just came out recently. That said, I mostly meet writers through conventions, and most of the conventions I go to are in the South United States. So a lot of the writers tend to be from the Southern United States.
Do you mind talking about some of those conventions? I guess you go to different horror conventions, or do you ever go to South by Southwest?
I'm a native Austinite, so I don't go to South by Southwest. Because I grew up going to South by Southwest. 1 second. Honey, shush. As soon as the rice goes off, I'm going to pause this to go get you dinner, okay? But the rice hasn't stopped cooking yet. Okay. So as far as conventions go, the main one I do is KillerCon. It's the Splatterpunk convention. We've done it online the last couple of years to keep everyone safe. But when it's in person, we only have 100 people. There's only 100 tickets. It's very small. It's more of a summer camp or a family reunion. And it's the best time of my life. All my dearest friends and Splatterpunk family go there. We have an award ceremony. It's amazing. There are a lot of other horror conventions. There's StokerCon, there's Scares That Care, there's Texas Frightmare Weekend. There's a ton of them. But if there's going to be horror celebrities there, it's rarely worth my time to go. I'll go to Texas Frightmare because I want to meet and hang out with Clive Barker. But, I'm not no one's going to come to my little rinky dink book table and buy books when they can go meet Clive Barker instead. So, or horror film conventions are the worst. I've never heard so many people tell me, "Oh, I don't read," as they stand in front of a table full of books.
Really, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's awful.
And like at the conventions, like we'll also talk about like the independent book scene, like in Texas. There are a lot of like independent bookstores there that feature your writings or other independent writers there in the state.
In theory,
Mm-hmm.
there's not. There's not for what I do. There's a lot of independent bookstores.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one that I love called Book Woman. That's a feminist, like queer friendly bookstore.
Mm-hmm.
And we are, Manus Art Press. We're feminists. We're queer friendly, but we're not publishing a lot of books that they would feel empowering, which is their whole thing. And I respect that. So, and then a lot of the other, the main one here would be Book People. And it's like, okay, I'm a local publisher. I'd love to get books on your shelf. Okay, well, you need to pay us this much, and you can pay us this much. It's like, I don't think you heard the part where I said I'm an independent author. Like, I don't have money. What are you talking about? So I know authors in various states, they build relationships with bookstores. I would love to do that. But just as we were kind of building steam as a company, COVID-19 hit, and now it's like, I can't do book readings anywhere. I can't do book signings anywhere. So maybe once this is all over, we'll find the places that are still open. But book reading, conventions, conferences, and online is where most of our sales and our footprint is.
And you have like I guess you're working on several books right now at once, I guess. Are you like?
Yep.
Wow. And
yeah,
so go ahead.
I was gonna say I tend to work on 3 to 4 books at a time. There's other authors like Jeff Strand who will bounce between whatever's interesting him at the time. I try for a certain word count every day. So the main thing I'm working gets 1,000 words every day. The secondary thing I'm working on gets 500 words every day. And then I'm like, okay, it's Friday. I need to take a small break. I'll work on 2 smaller projects and I'll do 250 words of each a day. And so I'm trying to do between 1,000 to 2,000 words a day, split between these 4 projects.
That's great. And do you mind like talking about with the listeners on this podcast any upcoming projects you're working on?
Yeah, I have. The second half of this year is kind of crazy for me. So starting this month, I have 2 stories in a anthology called Drown the World. I have a story in a Antifa Splatterpunk anthology coming out in December. A Jewish really kind of extreme horror Jewish story in the Big Book of Jewish Horror that I mentioned earlier. And then my series, The Crimes and Passions of John Baltisberger, has just 1 more entry this year. So the second one, which is called Antiva, is coming out this year. And in theory, I will have the start of my Psalm Sungen Spores series launching this year, which is a kind of Metroid meets Warhammer 40K with kind of a queer bent, deep space, holy war horror thing.
And John, for the listeners of this podcast who aren't familiar, can you describe a little bit about Splatterpunk in general and like other writers that are also like any famous writers that are really noted for that?
Yeah, so the big famous writers that are considered splatterpunks: Clive Barker, Brian Keene, Edward Lee, Rath James White, John Skip, who I mentioned earlier. These are all people that have been known for writing that messy, gory stuff. at my end of the spectrum of horror, you tend to get two schools of horror: extreme horror and splatterpunk. Extreme horror is no holds bar, sickening things that get books banned. I have a friend named Rain Havoc. She's had 3 books banned on Amazon.
Wow.
And she's a really good writer, but she writes some stuff that makes your stomach churn.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have on the other side of that same branch, you have splatterpunk, extremely violent, gory, descriptive, and vivid, but usually with some kind of socio-political like motive. Whereas extreme often isn't trying to say anything other than here's how far I can take it. Splatterpunks tend to be trying to make a point of some sort. And I'm generalizing right now, obviously. Bizarro tends to also kind of come into our court, but obviously it's an entire other genre that exists. I see you keep giving me a very confused look every time I mention Bizarro.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with them. I'm definitely familiar with Splatter, like with Clive Barker. Like I remember reading like this Books of Blood stories and the Damnation Game and the Wii World, a lot of that stuff. His early stuff, and of course his films and stuff like that.
Yeah. I might consider Imagica to almost be Bizarro, actually. Talking about Barker, but Bizarro is a genre in which you ignore logic, where you set a premise that can't possibly be true, and then you treat it as though it's real. There's an author named Carlton Mellick III, who is a master. He's amazing. And a lot of people say, "Oh, Bizarro is funny." And it can be funny, but it can also be heart-wrenching and amazing. And CM3 is amazing at that. Frank Edler is another Bizarro author who I think he has an amazing sense of humor, does really well. If you've never read Bizarro before, I really strongly recommend it because it's a very unique genre that has a lot to offer readers.
Has there been any like film adaptations for those authors, or like television or cable?
There's nothing from those authors in film that I know of. However, The Mighty Boosh, I would say, is a Bizarro TV show. There was a cartoon I was talking about just the other day that's would say Bizarro. Most cartoons are Bizarro, even like the very serious ones, where it's like, you have to take these hard left turns into something that doesn't make sense logically and just kind of accept it as what's happening. And again, mostly comedy is done Bizarro on film and TV, but at the same time, I would say like Brazil could probably be considered Bizarro. Bizarro.
Science fiction, like a lot of science fiction stuff.
A lot of science fiction is science. I wouldn't call most science fiction Bizarro, simply because there are certain rules to science fiction, and no, I don't know them, that exist.
What are some of the biggest joys and challenges of being a writer and publisher?
Yeah. Being both is crazy. Don't do that. Lots of us do, unfortunately. Max Booth III, one of my favorite authors of all time, is also a fantastic publisher. But you have to balance and you have to juggle really hard. And personally, I don't want to self-publish too much because people then will start to look at my Manusart Press as a vanity press, or he just does that to self-publish, and I don't. We're legitimately looking for other authors and always working with other authors. I don't mind doing my Jewish stuff through Manusart, through A Gotta Try It, because I'm building a community there. But my non-Jewish stuff, I always want to try to find another publisher for.
And do you mind talking? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
So it's a balancing act, and it's not one I particularly enjoy, but it's one that I think is, I can't close down Madness Art Press if my writing career takes off, because we're working with all these amazing authors and they count on us as their publisher. And likewise, I'm never going to stop writing. So it's kind of just this juggling act that I've condemned myself and my wife to for the rest of our lives.
Do you mind like discussing a little bit? I know I'm aware that you do a podcast as well called Wandering Monster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do a little podcast. It's rinky dink. It's just me and a couple of friends talking about our favorite monsters. It's really simple. It's just something, honestly, it's almost more just to hang out with my friends and chat than it is anything else.
You guys ever like have special guests on your
podcast? We do. We bring game designers on that are working building like tabletop RPGs. We bring them on to talk about designing monsters and inspiration for monsters in their games.
Wow, are these like local like video game designers or in Texas?
I generally find them on Kickstarter. I find a project I like and I send them a message and I'm like, hey, do you have a cool project? You want to come and talk to us about it?
Wow.
And it usually goes pretty well because, people are trying to get money. So
I could see like a game developed, like incorporating Jewish horror.
Eventually I'm going to do it. I just, tacking on game designer to the laundry list of things I have going on each and every day is a little too daunting for me at this point.
Are there any unusual stories you want to share, John, about like in regards to your writing? Anything that you were in regards to research or anything that you just like when you're writing something, you're just like I don't know, just anything crazy as a writer over the years?
Well, how about this? Not recently, last year I wrote a book called War of Dictates. War of Dictates is a book of Talmudic horror, which is a weird statement to say. It's also entirely in verse. It's a weird thing. But there's a name I'm sure you're familiar with, Asmodeus.
Mm-hmm.
Asmodeus is the Romanization of the word or name Ashmandai. Ashmandai is the prince of demons, or the Shadim, who in the Talmud is the one that King Solomon traps and like uses to build the temple, or traps and then uses that information. Anyway, long story. When I was researching Ashmandai, I was reading the Talmudic references to him, and as he was being dragged back to Jerusalem, he stops and he sees a blind man, and he tells the blind man, oh, you need to take 10 steps forward, take 14 steps left, and then dig. And the guard who's dragging him goes, why'd you do that? Oh, there's a sack of gems there, and it is written in heaven that whoever helps this blind man, shall have a place in the world to come. Okay, fine. And they keep going and keep going. And they come across a drunk man, and Ashmandai goes, oh, you need to take 5 steps right and then go down the alley and then 6 steps left. Guy goes, oh, so what's that guy's deal? Well, that guy's an a-hole, and it's written in heaven, whoever vexes him will have a place in the world to come. And it's fun. It's a really funny moment because Ashmandai helps someone, Ashmandai hurts someone, but Ashmandai, this demon, right, has intimate knowledge of what's going on in heaven and is assured a place in the world to come, which really flips the entire script of like what most Christian demons are like and how they behave and what they have. Like, there's no eternal damnation. And so this character, this demon prince, is like, no, I see an opportunity here. I'm going to make sure I get into heaven, essentially. It's fun. It's a fun story because it has so much personality and so much wit, and it's very characteristic for Jewish stories and myths.
Do you study like other like you study Yiddish or Hebrew? Have you incorporated that in your writings?
I do. I know a little bit of. I know my prayers. I know a little bit of Hebrew, and I started the Duolingo Yiddish thing. Um, the problem is I don't have anyone to practice either language with, and so it's very difficult to grow knowledge of that language. Eventually, I hope to be able to learn both fluently, but not in the near future, probably.
And like, what kind of guidance would you give to any young writers out there or publishers?
What I say to publishers, to anyone who's thinking about publishing, I would say think long and hard. Think long and hard about you if you really want to do this. Maybe intern with an indie publisher because it's a lot of hard work and not a lot of money, and it's often thankless. So maybe think real hard before you do that. To writers, to people who want to write, stop outlining. Stop daydreaming about what plot points or what characters are going to be like or what scenes, and just start writing. You have to write. If you need an outline, write an outline, but stop going to events and telling people, oh, I'm a writer. I have all these books in my head. Just sit down and start writing 200 words a day, 250 words a day. The more you write, the more you can write. You build stamina, you build willpower and discipline. And so that 200 words a day becomes 500 words a day, becomes 1,000 words a day, and 1,000 words a day after 2 months. That's a 70,000 word book. That's a novel. You don't need to work on the next great American novel. You need to work on the novel you're able to write right now. Write a novella, write a short story, but write, do it, do the thing.
Do you like in the past? Did you ever like put together like independent like zines for writers or collaborate with other writers?
I've done. Manuscript Press has published a few anthologies. Rooster, Saint Rooster Books, who publishes a lot of my kaiju stuff. He got started like going down to the FedEx and printing zines. But by the time I had skin in the game, I was Kindle existed and indie self-publishing existed. So I kind of dove right in to the deep end. And I put out some pretty shitty books. Not shitty like stories, but like my editing wasn't on point for those books, or my formatting wasn't on point for those books. But this is key to my last point. They exist. I put out those books. And my next book got better. My next book got even better after that.
And with your publishing company, do you accept like cold submissions, or like anybody can contact you, or?
I have a submission time, which is generally January to May, where I'll accept pitches, and then I'll occasionally put out submission calls for specific anthologies, or more likely I'll invite people to submit to an anthology. Except for Jewish speculative authors, you are always welcome to submit.
And like, would you be open if you got like some authors that are like, like from Israel? Maybe they would would you publish anything in a different language outside of English?
I can't edit it is the problem. Yeah. I don't. And the other thing is there's a racism problem in Israel between like Ashkenazi European Jews and like Ethiopian Jews, and if I can't read what you wrote, I don't know that you didn't say some rancid stuff about people of color, so I'm not going to publish it. So like in theory, I'd love to publish some Israeli stuff. In practice, I have to know what I'm publishing before I do it.
Hello, thanks for listening to the Erratic Dispatches podcast. We'll be back shortly after a brief break. Thanks again for tuning in to this latest episode of the Erratic Dispatches podcast. featuring an interview with my guest, John Baltisberger, who's the founder of the publishing company Madness Heart Press and prolific author and poet of Jewish horror. For the profile page on my Anchor FM, there is a contribution button. So any kind of donation would be greatly appreciated. I've been running this podcast now through my digital publishing company, Utra Tomes, now for about a year and a half. And I appreciate any kind of donation. And there's also donation buttons located on the website for RockDispatches.brooklyndigitalmediainc.com. Thanks again for listening. I'll be back soon with a new episode. Take care. Bye-bye.